So there was a man crawling through the desert. He decided to try his SUV in a little bit of cross-country travel. Had great fun zooming over the badlands and through the sand. Got lost, hit a big rock, then he couldn't get it started again. There were no cell phone towers anywhere near, so his cell phone was useless. He had no family, his parents had died a few years before in an auto accident, and his few friends had no idea he was out here. He stayed with the car for a day or so, but this one bottle of water ran out and he was getting thirsty. He thought maybe he knew the direction back, now that he paid attention to the sun and thought he figured out which way was north. So he decided to start walking. He figured he had only had to go about 30 miles or so and he'd be back to the small town he'd gotten gas in last. He thinks about walking at night to avoid the heat and sun, but based on upon how dark it actually was the night before, and given that he has no flashlight, he's afraid he'll break a leg or step on a rattlesnake. So he put on some sunblock, put the rest in his pocket for reapplication later, brings an umbrella he had in the back of the SUV with him to give him a little shade, pours the windshield wiper fluid into his water bottle in case he got that desperate, brings his pocket knife in case he finds a cactus that looks like it might have water in it, and heads out in the direction he thinks is right. He walks for the entire day. By the end of the day, he's really thirsty. He's been sweating all day, and his lips are starting to crack. He's reapplied the sunblock twice and tried to stay under the umbrella, but he still feels sunburned. The windshield wiper fluid sloshing in the bottle in his pocket is really getting tempting now. He knows that it's mainly water and some ethanol coloring, but he knows that they add some kind of poison to it to keep people from drinking it. He wonders what the poison is, and whether the poison would be worse than dying of thirst. He pushes on, trying to get that small town before dark. By the end of the day, he starts getting worried. He's figured he's been walking for at least 3 miles an hour, according to his watch, for over 10 hours. That means that if his entire estimate was right, he should be close to the town, but he doesn't recognize any of this. He had to cross a dry creek bed a mile to her back, and he doesn't remember coming through it in the SUV. He figures that he might got his direction off just a little, and that the dry creek bed was just off one side of his path. He tells himself that he's close, and then after dark he'll start seeing the town's light over these hills, and that'll be all he needs. As it gets dim enough that he starts stumbling over small rocks and things, he finds a spot and sits down to wait for full dark and the town's light. Full dark comes before he knows it. He must have dozed off. He stands back up and turns all the way around, and he sees nothing but stars. He wakes up the next morning feeling absolutely lousy. His eyes were all gummy, and his mouth and nose feel like they've been full of sand. He's so thirsty that he can't even swallow. He barely.
Do we walk into a fan fiction or something?
I heard someone saying this shit in the doorway.
Okay. He wakes up the next morning feeling absolutely lousy. His eyes are gloomy and his mouth and nose feel slightly. Hang on. He knows the rules of three. 3 minutes without air, 3 days without water, 3 weeks without food, then you die. Some people can make it a little longer in the best situations. Hang on. Let me just. Okay.
No, fuck this shit.
3 weeks without food, then you die. Some people can make it a little longer in the best situation, but the desert, heat, and having to walk in sweat isn't the best situation to be without water. He figures unless he finds water, this is his last day. He rinses his mouth out with a little bit of windshield wiper fluid. He waits a while after spitting that little bit out to see if his mouth goes numb or he feels dizzy or something. Has his mouth gone numb? Is it just in his mind? He's not sure. He'll go a little farther, and if he doesn't find water, he'll be drinking some of the fluid. Then he has his next harder question: which way does he go from here? Does he keep walking the same way like he was yesterday, assuming that he still knows which way that is? Or does he try a new direction? He has no idea what to do. Looking at the hills and dudes around him, he thinks he knows the direction he was heading before. Just going by a feeling, he points himself somewhere to the left of that. He starts walking. And as he walks, the day starts heating up. The desert, too cold a couple of hours before, soon becomes an oven again. He sweats a little, okay, and then stops. He starts getting worried at that. When you stop sweating, he knows that means you're in trouble, usually right before heat stroke. He decides that it's time to try the windshield and wiper fluid. He can't wait any longer. If he passes out, he's dead. He stops in the shake of a large rock, takes the bottle out, opens it, and takes a mouthful. He slowly swallows it, making it last as long as he can. It feels so good in his dry and cracked throat that he doesn't even care about the nasty taste. He takes another mouthful and it makes it last too. Slowly he drinks half the bottle. He figures that since he's drinking it, he might as well drink enough to make some difference and keep himself from passing out. He's quite worrying about the ditch or whatever of the wiper fluid. If it kills him, it kills him. He didn't drink it, he died anyway. Besides, he's pretty sure that whatever substance they deter the fluid is just designed to make you sick. Their way of keeping winnows from buying cheap wiper fluid for the ethanol content. He can handle throwing up if it comes to that. He walks in the hot, dry, windless desert. Sand, rocks, hills, dunes, the occasional scrawny cactus or dried bush. No signs of water. Sometimes he'll see a little movement to one side or another, but whenever it moved, it usually gone before he can focus his eyes on it. Probably birds, lizards, or mice, maybe snakes, and they usually move before more at night. He's careful to stay away from the movements. After a while, he begins to stagger. He's not sure if it's fatigue, heat stroke, finally catching him, or maybe he was wrong, and the eternation of the wiper fluid was worse than he thought. He tries to steady himself, and he keeps going. After more walking, he comes across a large stretch of sand. This is good. He knows he passed over a stretch of sand in the SUV. He remembers doing donuts in it, or at least he thinks he remembers it. He's getting woozy enough and tired enough that he's not sure what he remembers more or hallucinating, but he thinks he remembers it. So he heads off into it, trying to get to the other side, hoping that it gets him closer to his town. He was heading for a town, wasn't he? He think he was. He wasn't sure anymore. He's not even sure how long he's been walking anymore. Is it still morning, or has it moved into afternoon and the sun is going down again? It must be afternoon. It seems like it's been too long since he started out. He walks through the sand. After a while, he comes to a big dune in the sand. This is bad. He doesn't remember any dunes when driving over the SUV. Or at least he doesn't think he remembers any. This is bad. But he has no other direction to go. Too late to turn back now. He figures that he'll get on top of the dune and see if he can see anything from the top that helps him find the town. He keeps going up the dune. Halfway up, he slips in the bad footing of the sand for a second or third time and he falls to his knees. He doesn't feel like getting back up. He'll just fall down again. So he keeps going up the dune on his hands and knees. While crawling, if his throat weren't so dry, he'd laugh. He'd finally gotten to the image of a man lost in the desert, crawling through the sand in his hands and knees. It would be the perfect image, he imagines. If only his clothes were more ragged. The people crawling through the desert in the cartoons have always had ragged clothes, but his have lasted without any rips so far. Somebody will probably find his desiccated corpse half buried in the sand for years now, and his clothes will still be in fine shape. Shake the sand out in a good wash, and they'll be wearable again. He wishes his throat were wet enough to laugh. He coughs a little instead, and it hurts. He finally makes up the top of the sand dune. Now that you're at the top, he struggles a little, but he manages to stand up and look around, and all he sees is sand. Sand and more sand. Behind him, about a mile away, he thinks he saw a rocky ground he left into the sand. Ahead of him, more dunes, more sand. This isn't where he drove the SUV. This is hell, or close enough. Again, he doesn't know what to do. He decides to drink the rest of the wiper fluid while figuring it out. He takes out the bottle and is removing the cap. He glances to the side and sees something. Something in the sand. At the bottom of the dune, off to the side, he sees something strange. It's a flat area in the sand. He stops taking the cap off the bottle and tries to look closer. The area seems to be circular and it's dark. Darker than the sand, and there seems to be something in the middle of it, but he can't tell what it is. He looks as hard as he can, but he still can't tell from here. He's going to have to go down there and take a look. He puts the bottle back in his pocket and starts to stumble down the dune. After a few steps, he realizes that he's in trouble. He's not going to be able to keep up his balance. After a couple more sliding, tottering steps, he falls and starts to roll down the dune. The sand is so hot when his body hits it for that minute. He thinks he caught fire on the way down, like a movie car wreck flashing into flames. It goes off over the cliff before it even hits the ground. He closes his eyes and his mouth, covers his face with his hands, and waits to stop rolling. He stops at the bottom of the dune. After a minute or two, he finds enough energy to try to sit up and get to stand out from his clothes. When he clears his eyes enough, he looks around to make sure that the dark spot in the sand was still there and he hadn't just imagined it. So seeing this large, flat, dark spot on the sand is still here, he begins to crawl towards it. He'd get up and walk towards it, but he doesn't seem to have the energy to get up and walk right now. He must be in the final stages of dehydration, he figures. As he crawls, if this place is in sand, doesn't have water, he'll likely never make it anywhere else. This is his last chance. He gets closer and closer, but still can't see what's in the middle of the dark area. His eyes won't quite focus on anymore for some reason, and lifting up his head takes so much effort he gives up trying. He just keeps crawling. Finally, he reaches the area he'd seen from the dune. It takes him a minute of crawling on it before he realizes that he's no longer on sand. He's now crawling on some kind of dark stone. Stone with some kind of marking on it. A pattern cut into the stone. He's too tired to stand up and try to see what the pattern is, so he just keeps crawling. He crawls towards the center, where his blurry eyes still see nothing in the middle of the dark stoned area. His mind, detached in a strained way, notes that either his hands or knees are so burnt by the end of the day that they can't no longer feel pain, or that this dark sun in the middle of a burning desert with a pounding, punishing sun overhead doesn't seem to be hot. It feels almost cool. He considers lying down on the nice cool surface. Cool, dark stone, not a good sign. He must be hallucinating this. He's probably in the middle of a patch of sand, already lying face down and dying, and just imagining the whole thing. A desert mirage. Soon the beautiful woman carrying pitchers of water will come up and start giving him a drink. Then he'll know he's gone. He decides against laying down on the cool zone. If he's going to die here in the middle of this hallucination, he at least wants to see what's in the center before he goes. He keeps crawling. It's the third time that he hears the voice before he realizes he's hearing. He would swear that someone just said, "Greetings, traveler, do not look well, do you hear me?" He stops crawling. He tries to look up from where he is on his hands and knees, but it's too much effort to lift his head, so he tries something different. He leans back and tries to sit up on the stone. After a very few seconds, he catches his balance, avoids falling on his face, sits up and tries to focus his eyes. Blurry, he rubs his eyes with the back of his hands and tries again. Better this time. Yep, he can see. He's sitting in the middle of a large, flat, dark expanse of stone. Directly next to him, about 3 feet away, is a white post or pole, about 2 inches in diameter and sticking up for about 4 or 5 feet out of the stone at an angle. And wrapped around this white rod tailed with a rattle on it hovering, it seems to be ready to start rattling. It must be a 15-foot long desert diamondback rattlesnake looking directly at him. He stares at the snake in a shock. He doesn't have the energy to get up and run away. He doesn't have the energy to crawl away. This is it, his final resting place. No matter what happens, he's not going to be able to move from the spot. Well, at least dying of a bite from this monster should be quicker than dying of thirst. He'll face his end like a man. He struggles to sit up a little straighter. The snake keeps watching him. He lifts one hand and waves it in the snake's direction, feebly. The snake watches the hand for a moment, then goes back to watching the man, looking into his eyes. Maybe the snake had no interest in biting him. It hadn't rattled yet. This was a good sign. Maybe he wasn't going to die out of a snake bite after all. Then he remembers that he looked up when he reached the center here because he thought he heard a voice. He was still very woozy. He was likely to pass out, and soon. The sun still beat on him, even though he was now in cool stone. He still didn't realize anything to drink, but maybe he had actually heard a voice. The stone didn't look natural, nor did the white post sticking out of the stone. Someone had to have built this. Maybe there was stone nearby. Maybe that was who talked to him. Maybe the snake was even their pet, and that's why it wasn't biting. He tries to clear his throat and say hello, but his throat is too dry. All that comes out is coughing or wheezing sound. There is no way he's going to be able to talk without something to drink. He feels his pocket and the bottle of the wiper fluid still there. He shakily pulls the bottle out, almost losing his balance and falling on his back in the process. This isn't good. He doesn't have much time left, by his reckoning, before he passes out. He gets the lid off the bottle, manages to get the bottle to his lips and pours some of the fluid into his mouth. He sloshes it around and then swallows it. He coughs a little. His throat feels better. Maybe he can talk now. He tries again, ignoring the snake. He turns to look at him, hoping for the spot of the owner place, and croaks out, "Hello, is there anyone there?" He hears from the side, "Greetings, what is it you want?" He turned his head, put back towards the snake where the sound seemed to come from. The only thing he can think of that there must be a speaker hidden under the snake, or maybe built into the post. He decides to try asking for help. "Please," he croaks again, suddenly feeling dizzy. "I love not to be thirsty anymore. It's been a long time since without water." Please, can you help me? Looking in the direction of the snake, hoping to see where the voice is coming from this time, he is shocked to see that the snake rear back, open its mouth, and speak. He hears it say, as the dizziness overtakes him and falls forward, face forward into the stone. Very well, coming up. A piercing pain shoots through his shoulder. Suddenly he is awake. He sits up and grabs his shoulder, wincing at the throbbing pain. He's momentarily disoriented as he looks around, and then he remembers to crawl across the sand. The dark area of stone. The snake. He sees the snake still wrapped around the tilted white post, still looking at him. He reaches up and feels his shoulder where it hurts. It feels slightly wet. He pulls his finger away and looks at them. Blood. He feels the shoulder again. His shirt has what feels like 2 holes in it. 2 puncture holes. The matchup of the 2 aching spots on his shoulder. He had been bitten. Bitten by the snake. It'll feel better in a minute. He looks up. It's the snake talking. He hadn't dreamed it. Suddenly he notices he's not dizzy anymore, and importantly, he's not thirsty anymore. At all. Have I died? Is this the afterlife? Why are you biting me in the afterlife? Sorry about that, but I had to bite you, says the snake. That's the way I work. It all comes across the bite. Think of it as a natural medicine. You bit me to help me? Why aren't I thirsty anymore? Did you give me a drink before you bit me? How did I drink enough while unconscious enough to not be thirsty anymore? I haven't had a drink for over 2 days, well, except for the windshield wiper fluid. Hold on. How in the world does a snake talk? Are you real? Are you some sort of Disney animation? No, says the snake. I'm real. As you or anyone else is. Anyway, I didn't give you a drink. I bit you. That's how it works. It's what I do. I bite. I don't have hands to give you a drink, even if I had water just sitting around here. The man sat stunned for a minute. Here he was, sitting in the middle of the desert, on some strange stone that should be hot but wasn't, talking to a snake that could talk back had just bitten him. And he felt better. Not great. He was still starving and exhausted, but much better. He was no longer thirsty. He started to sweat again, but only slightly. He felt hot in the sun, but it was starting to get lower in the sky, and the cool stone beneath him was a relief. He could notice how he was no longer dying of thirst. I might suggest that we take care of that methanol you now have in your system with the next request, continued the snake. I can guess why you drink it, but I'm not sure you drink, or how much methanol was left in the wiper fluid. That stuff is nasty. It'll make you go blind in a day or 2 if you drink enough of it. Next request, said the man. He put his hand back on the hurting shoulder and backed away from the snake. That's the way it works, if you like, that is, explained the snake. You get 3 requests. Call them wishes if you wish. The snake grinned at his own joke, and the man drew a little further from the show of fangs. But there are rules, the snake continued. The first request is free. The second requires an agreement of secrecy. The third request requires the binding of responsibility. The snake looks at the man seriously. By the way, the snake says suddenly, my name is Nathan. Old Nathan. Samuel used to call me. He gave me the name. Before that, most of the band used to call me Snake, but that got old. And Samuel wouldn't stand for it. He said that anything that could talk needed a name. He was big into names. You can call me Nate if you wish. Again, then Snake grinned. Sorry if I don't offer to shake, but I think you can understand. My shake sounds somewhat threatening. The snake gave a little rattle shake. My name is Jack, said the man, trying to absorb all this. Jack Sampson. Can I ask you a question? Jack says suddenly. What happened to the poison in your bite? Why aren't I dying now? How did you do that? What do you mean by that's how you work? That's more than one question, grins Nate, but I'll try to answer all of them. First, yes, you can ask me a question. The snake grins gets wider. Second, the poison is in you. It changed you. You now no longer need to drink. That's what you asked for. Or, well, technically. You asked not to be thirsty anymore, but anymore is such a vague term. I decided to make it permanent. Now, as long as you live, you shouldn't need to drink much at all. Your body will conserve water very efficiently. You should be able to get enough just from the food you eat. Much like a creature of the desert, you've changed. For the third question, Nate continues, you are still dying. Besides the effect of the methanol in your system, you're a man, and men are mortal. In your current state, I give you no more than about another 50 years, assuming you get out of this desert alive, that is. Nate seems very vastly amused at his own humor, and continued his wide grin. As for the fourth question, Nate said, looking more serious as Jack could tell, as Jack was just now working on his ability to read talking snake emotions from snake facial features. First, you have to agree to make a second request and become bound by secrecy, or else I can't tell you. Wait, joked Jack. Isn't this where you say you could tell me, but you have to kill me? I thought that was implied, and they continued to look serious. Yeah. Jack leaned back a little as he remembered again that he was talking to a 15-foot poisonous reptile with a reputation for having a nasty temper. So, what is this bound by secrecy stuff? And can you really stop the effects of the methanol? Jack thought for a second, and what do you mean? Methanol anyway. I thought these days they use ethanol in wiper fluid and just endure it. They may, I don't know, said Nate. I haven't gotten out in a while. Maybe they do. All I know is that I smell methanol on your breath and on that bottle in your pocket. And the blue color of Wicked when he pulled it out to drink some, and let me guess, that was wiper fluid. I assume that they still color wiper fluid blue? Yeah, they do, said Jack. I figured, replied Nate. As for being bound by secrecy with the fulfillment of your next request, you will be bound to say nothing about me, this place, or the way of the information I will tell you after that. When you decide to go back to your kind, you won't be allowed to talk about me, write about me, use sign language, charades, or even act in a way that will lead someone to guess correctly about me. You bound to secrecy. Of course, I'll also ask you to promise not to give me away, and I'm guessing that you're a man of your word. You'll never test the binding anyway, so you won't notice. Nate said the last part with utter confidence. Jack, who had always prided himself on being a man of his words, felt a little nervous at this. Hey, Nate, who are you? How did you know that? Are you, omniscient or something? Well, Jack, said Nate, I can't tell you that unless you make a second request. Nate looked away for a minute, then looked back. Well, okay. What is the second request? What can I ask for? Are you allowed to tell me that? Sure, said Nate, brightly. You're allowed to ask for changes to yourself, like their wishes, but they can only affect you. And before I ask, I can't give you immortality or omniscience. Or, for that matter, that I might be able to make you gaseous and yet remain alive, and then you could spread through the atmosphere and I sort of be omnipresent. But what good would that be? You still wouldn't be omniscient, and thus you can only focus on one thing at a time. Not very useful at least in my opinion. Nate stopped and he realized that Jack was staring at him. Well, anyway, continued Nate, I'd probably suggest giving you permanent good health. It would negate the methanol now in your system. You'd be immune to most poisonous and diseases, and you tend to live a very long time, bearing accident, of course, and then you have a tendency to recover from accidents well. It always seemed like a good choice for a request to me. Cure that methanol poisoning, huh? Said Jack. And keep me healthy for a long time? Doesn't sound that bad at that. And it has to be the request to change about me? I can't ask to be rich, right? Because that's not really a good change to me. Right, nodded Nate. Can I ask to be a genius and permanently healthy? That's hopefully. That takes 2 requests, Jax. Yeah, I figured so, said Jack. But could I ask to be a genius? I could become the smartest scientist in the world, or the best athlete. Well, I could make you very smart, admitted Nate, without necessarily make you the best scientist in the world. Or I can make you very athletic, but it won't necessarily make you the best athlete either. You heard the saying that 99% of genius is hard work? Well, there's some truth to that. I can give you the talent, but I can't make you work hard. It all depends on what you decide to do with it. Said Jack. Okay, I think I understand, and I get the third request after this one? Maybe, said Nate. Depends on what you decide then. There are more rules for the third question that I can only tell you about after the second request. You know how it goes. And Nate looked like he'd shrug, if he'd had shoulders. Well, since I'd rather not be blinded in a day or two, and permanent health doesn't sound that bad, then consider my second request. Officially, do I need to sign in blood or something? No, said Nate. Just hold out your hand or heel, Nate grinned, or whatever part you want me to bite. I have to bite you again, like I said, that's how it works, the poison, you know, Nate said apologetically. Jack winced at a little felt in the shoulder where the last bite was. Hey, it didn't hurt anymore, just like Nate had said. That made Jack feel better about the biting business, but still, standing still with the 15-foot snake shrugged its fangs into you, Jack stood up, ignoring how good it felt to be able to stand again. And the hunger starting to gnaw at his stomach. Jack just tried to decide where he wanted to get bitten. Despite knowing that it wouldn't hurt for long, Jack knew this wasn't going to be easy. Hey, Jack, Nate suddenly said, looking past Jack towards the dunes behind him. Is that someone else coming up over there? Jack spun around and looked. Who else could be out here in the middle of nowhere? Did they bring food? Wait a minute, there was no one over there. What was Nate? Jack let out a bellow as he felt two fangs seek into his rear end through his jeans. Jack sat down carefully, favoring his more tender buttock. I would have decided eventually, Nate. I was just thinking about it. You wouldn't have to hoodwink me like that. I've been doing this for a long time, Jack, said Nate confidently. You humans have a hard time sitting still and letting a snake bite you, especially one of my size. And besides, admit it, it's only been a couple of minutes and it already doesn't hurt anymore, does it? That's because the health benefit with this one, I told you that you'd heal quickly now. Yeah, well, still, said Jack, it's the principle of the thing, and nobody likes being bitten in the butt. Couldn't you have gotten my half calf or something instead? More meat in the typical human butt, replied Nate, and less chance of you accidentally kick me or move at the last second. Yeah, right. So tell me, all these wonderful secrets I now qualify to hear, answered Jack. Okay, said Nate. Do you want to ask a question first, or do you want me to just start talking? Just talk, said Jack. I'll sit there and try not to think about the food. We could try to rustle up some food for you if you like, answered Nate. Hey, you didn't tell me we had food around here, Nate. Jack jumped up. What do we have? Am I walking distance to the town, or can you magically whip up food along with your other powers? Jack was almost shouting with excitement. His stomach had been growling for hours. I was thinking more like I could flush something out of this. It's a whole bite for you, and you could just sink in and eat it, assuming you have a knife, that is, replied Nate, with a grin that Jack was starting to get used to. Said Jack, sitting back down, I think I'll pass. I can last a little longer before I get desperate enough to eat desert rat, or what else you find out here. And there's nothing to burn. I have to eat it raw. No thanks, just talk. Okay, replied Nate, still grinning, but I'd better hurry before you start looking at me as food. Nate reared back a little, looked around for a second, and then continued. You, Jack, are sitting in the middle of the Garden of Eden. Jack looked around the sand dunes and looked back at Nate skeptically. Well, that's the best I can figure it. Anyway, Jack, said Nate, stand up and look at the symbol on the rock here. Nate gestured around the dark stone as they were both sitting on with his nose. Jack stood up and looked. Carved into the stone was a bas relief with a representation of a large tree. The angel pole that was Nate was wrapped around was coming out of the trunk of the tree. Right below there was main branches left to the trunk. Reach out across the line. It was very well done. It looked more like a tree had been reduced to almost 2 dimensions and embedded in the stone like it did in like a carving. Jack had walked around and looked at the details in the fading light of the setting sun. He wished he'd look at it while the sun was higher in the sky. Wait, the sun was setting. That meant he was going to have to spend the night out here. God. Jack looked around across the desert for a little bit, and then he came back and stood next to Nate. In all the excitement, I almost forgot Nate. Which way is it back to town, and how far? I'm eventually going to have to head back. I'm not sure I'll be able to survive by eating raw desert critters for long, and even if I can, I'm not sure I want to. It's about 30 minutes away, Nate pointed, with the rattle on his tail this time. As far as Jack could tell, it was a direction that right angles to the way he'd been going as he was crawling there. But that's 30 miles, by the way. That crow flies. It's about 40 the way a man walks. You should be able to do it in half a day with your improved endurance if you head out early tomorrow, Jack. Jack looked out the way the snake had pointed for a few seconds more and then sat back down. It was getting dark. Not much he could do about heading out now, and besides, Nate was just about to get into the interesting stuff. Garden of Eden, as best as you can figure it. Well, yeah, as best as I and Samuel could figure it anyway, said Nate. He figured that the story just got a little bit mixed up, you know? Snake in a tree, offering temptations, making bargains, that kind of stuff. But he could never quite figure out how the Hebrews found out about the spot from across the ocean. He was worried about that for a while. Garden of Eden, huh? Said Jack. How long have you been here, Nate? No idea, really, replied Nate. A long time. It never occurred to me to count years until recently, and by then, of course, it was too late. But I do remember when this whole place was green, so I figured it'd been thousands of years at least. So are you the snake that tempted Eve? Said Jack. Beats me, said Nate. Maybe I can't remember if the first one of your kind I've talked to was female or not. And I never got a name. And it could have been. I don't know. I suppose she could have been conspired my offer to grant request as temptation, though I've rarely had refusals. Well, how did you get here then? And why is that white pole standing out of the stick stone there? Asked Jack. Dad left me here, or I assume it was my dad. It was another snake, much bigger than I was back then. I remember talking to him, but I don't remember if it was in the language or just kind of understanding what he wanted. But one day he brought me to the stone, told me about it, and asked me to do something for him. I talked it over with him for a while, then agreed. I've been here ever since. What is this place? And what did he ask you to do? Said Jack. Well, you see this pole here sticking out of the stone. Nate loosened his coils around the tilted white pole and showed Jack where it descended into the stone. The pole was tilted about a 45-degree angle and seemed to enter the stone in an 18-inch slot cut into the stone. Jack leaned over and looked. The slot was dark and the pole went down as far as Jack could see into the dim light. Jack reached out to touch the pole, but Nate was suddenly there in the way. You can't touch that yet, Jack, said Nate. Why not? I haven't explained it to you yet. Well, it kind of looks like a lever or something, said Jack. You'd push it in that way and then to move it in the slot? Yep, that's what it is. What does it do? End the world? Oh no, said Nate. Nothing that drastic. It just ends humanity, I called it. The lever of doom. For the last few words, Nate had used a deeper, ringing voice. He tried to look serious for a few seconds, then gave up and grinned. Jack was initially startled by Nate's pronouncement, and then Nate grinned and Jack laughed. Ha! You almost had me fooled for a second there. What does it really do? Oh, it really ends humanity, like I said, smirked Nate. I thought the voice I used was funny, didn't you? Nate continued to grin. A lever to end humanity? Asked Jack. What in the world was that for? Why would anyone need to end humanity? Well, replied Nate, I get the idea that maybe humanity was an experiment, or maybe the big guy just thought, if humanity started going really bad, there should be a way to end it. I'm not really sure. All I know, there are rules, and the guesses that Samuel and I had about why it's here. I didn't think to ask back when I started here. Rules? What rules? The rules are that I can't tell anybody about it or let them touch it unless they agree to be bound to secrecy by a bite. And that only one human can be bound in that way at a time. That's it, explained Nate. Jack looked up, somewhat shocked. You mean I could pull the lever now? You'd let me end humanity? Yup. If you want to. Nate looked at Jack carefully. Do you want to, Jack? No, said Jack, stepping a little further back from the lever. Why in the world would anyone want to end humanity? It'd take a psychotic to want that, or worse, a suicidal psychotic. But it would kill him too, wouldn't it? Yep. Being as he'd be human too. Has anyone ever seriously considered it? Asked Nate. Any of those bound to secrecy, that is? Well, of course. I think they've all seriously considered at one time or another. Being given that kind of responsibility makes you sit down and think. Or so I'm told. Samuel considered it several times. He'd often get disgusted with humanity, come out here and just hold the lever for a while, but he never pulled it, or you wouldn't be here. And then grinned some more. Jack sat down back from the lever. He looked, gazed, and thought, puzzled at the same time. After a bit, he said, so this makes me the judge of humanity. I get to decide whether they keep living or just end? Me? That seems to be it, agreed Nate. What kind of criteria do I use to decide, said Jack. How do I make this decision? Am I supposed to decide if they're good or too many of them are bad? Or what that they're doing wrong anyway? Is there a set of rules for that? Nope, replied Nate. You pretty much have to decide on your own. It's up to you, however you want to decide it. I guess that's what you're supposed to do now. But what if I get mad at someone or some girl dumps me and I just feel horrible? Couldn't I make a mistake? And how do I know if I won't ever screw up? Protested Jack. Nate gave his kind of snake-like shrug again. You don't. You just have to try your best, Jack. Jack sat there for a while, staring off to the desert that was rapidly getting dark, chewing on a fingernail. Suddenly, Jack turned around and looked at the snake. Nate, was Samuel the one bound to this before me? Yes, replied Nate. He was a good guy. Talked to me a lot. Taught me to read and brought me books. I think I still have a good pile of them buried in the sand somewhere here. I still miss him. He died a few months ago. Sounds like a good guy, agreed Jack. How did he handle this when you first told him? What did he do? Well, said Nate, he sat down for a while, thought about it for a bit, and then asked me some questions, much like you're doing. What did he ask you, if you're allowed to tell? Asked Jack. He asked me about the third request, replied Nate. Aha! It was Jack's turn to grin. And what did you tell him? I told him the rules for the third request. That to get the third request, you have to agree to the whole thing. that if it ever comes to the point that you really think humanity should be ended, that you come here and end it. You won't avoid it and you won't wimp out. Nate looked serious again. And you'll be bound to do it, Jack. Jack looked back into the darkness for a while. Nate watched him waiting. Nate? What did Samuel ask for his third request? Nate sounded like he was grinning again as he replied, and also quietly. Wisdom. He asked for wisdom. As much as I could give him. Okay, said Jack, suddenly standing up facing away. Give it to me. Nate looked at Jack's backside. What do you want? Wait, give you what, Jack? Give me that wisdom. The same stuff that Samuel asked for. If it helped him, maybe it'll help me too. Jack turned his head to look back over his shoulder at Nate. It did help him, right? He said it did, Nate. But he seemed a little quieter afterward, like he had a lot to think about. Yeah, well, I can see that. So give it to me. Jack turned to face away from Nate again, bent over slightly and tensed up. Nate watched Jack tense up with a little expression. If he bit Jack now, Jack would likely jump out of his skin and maybe hurt them both. You remember that you'll be bound to destroy humanity if it ever look like it needs to, right, Jack? Asked Nate, shifting position. Yeah, I got that. His eyes squeezed tightly and shut and body rose, tense, not noticing the change in direction of Nate's voice. And, continued Nate, do you remember that you turn bright purple and grow up big horns and extra eyes? Yeah. Hey, what? Said Jack, opening his eyes, straightening up and turning around. Purple? He didn't see Nate there. With the moonlight, Jack could see that the lever extended up from his slot in the rock without the snake wrapped around it. Jack heard from behind him, just kidding, right before he felt the now familiar piercing pain. This time, in this other buttock. Jack sat on the edge of the dark stone in the rapidly cooling air, his feet extending out into the sand. He stared out into the darkness, listening to the wind stir into the stand, occasionally rubbing his butt where he'd been recently bitten. Nate had left a while. He came back with a desert rodent-shaped bulge somewhere in his middle, and was now wrapped back around the lever. His tongue flickered out into the desert night air, only to sign that he was still awake. Occasionally, Jack, with his toes digging in the sand where he thought he would ask Nate a question without turning around. Nate, do accidents count? Nate lifted his head. What do you mean? Jack tilted his head like he was looking at the stars. You know, accidents. If I accidentally fall on the lever without meaning to, does it still wipe out humanity? Yeah, I'm pretty sure it does, Jack. I suggest you be careful about that if you start feeling wobbly, said Nate with some amusement. A little later, does it have to be me that pulls that lever? Asked Jack. That's the rule, Jack. Nobody else can pull it. No. I meant, does it have to be by my hand? Could I pull the lever with a rope tied around it, or push it with a stick, or throw a rock? Yes, those should work. Though I'm not sure how complicated you could get. Samuel thought about trying to build some sort of remote control for it once, but gave up. Everything he built would be gone by the next sunrise. If it was touching the stone or over it, I told him that in the past others that had been bound had tried to bury the lever so they would never be tempted to pull it, but every time the stones or stand or whatever had disappeared. Wow, said Jack. Cool. Jack leaned back until only his elbows kept him off the stone and looked up into the sky. Nate, how long did Samuel live? One of his wishes for health too, right? Asked Jack. Yes. He lived for 167 years, Jack. Wow, 167? That's almost 140 more years. I'll live if I live as long. Do you know what he died of, Nate? He died of getting tired of living, Jack. Jack turned his head to look at Nate in the starlight. Nate looked back. Samuel knew he wasn't going to be able to stay in society. He figured that they'd eventually see him still alive and start questioning it. So he decided that he had to disappear for a while. He faked his death once, but changed his mind. He decided it was too early, he could stay for a little longer. He wasn't very fond of mankind, but he liked the attention. Most of the time, anyway. His daughter, then wife dying, almost did him in the... He didn't stay in society much longer after that. He eventually came out at the time spent talking to me and thinking about pulling the lever a few months ago. He told me he had been through. It was his time. And then he just died? Asked Jack. Nate shook his head a little. He made his fourth request, Jack. There's only one thing you can ask for the fourth request. The last bite. After a bit, Nate continued. He told me that he was tired. That it was his time. He reassured me that someone new would show up soon like they always had. After another pause, Nate finished. Samuel's body disappeared off the stone within the sunrise. Jack lay back down on the sky, leaving Nate alone with his memories. It was a long time until Jack's breathing eventually evened out into sleep. Jack awoke the next morning. He was a little chilled with some morning desert air, but overall was feeling pretty good. Well, except that his stomach was grumbling and he was willing to eat the raw desert rat. So after getting directions to town from Nate, making sure he knew he'd get back, reassuring Nate that he'd be back soon, Jack started for the long walk back to town. With his new health and Nate's good directions, he made it back easily. Jack caught a bus out to the city and showed up to work for the next day. A little worse than Weir with a story about getting lost in the desert with coming back. Within a couple of days, Jack had talked a friend with a tow truck into going back out into the desert to fetch him an SUV. They found it after a couple of hours searching and towed it back without incident. Jack was careful not to even look in the direction of Nate's lever, though their path back didn't come within sight of it. Before the next weekend, Jack had gone a couple of times, including a bookstore, and had gotten his SUV back from the mechanic, with a warning to avoid any more joyriding in the desert. On Saturday, Jack headed back to see Nate. Jack parked a little way out of the small town near Nate, loaded up his new backpack with camping gear and the things he was bringing for Nate, and then started walking. He figured that walking would leave the least trail, and then he knew, well, not many people camped in the desert. It wasn't unheard of and shouldn't really raise suspicion. Jack had brought more books for Nate. Recent books, magazines, newspapers, some things that would catch up Nate with what was happening in the world, others that were just good books to read. He spent the weekend with Nate, and then headed out again, telling Nate that he'd be back soon, but that he had to do things first. Over 4 months later, Jack was back to see Nate again. This time he brought a laptop with him, a specially modified laptop. It was a solar recharger, special filters and seals to keep out the sand, a satellite link up, and a special keyboard and joystick with a jack that a 15-foot rattlesnake would be able to use, and it had been hacked to not give out his location to the satellite. After that, Jack could email Nate to keep in touch, but still visited him fairly regularly, at least once or twice a year. After the first year, Jack quit his job. For some reason, with the wisdom he'd been giving and the knowledge that he knew that he could live for over 150 years, working in a 9-to-5 job for someone else didn't seem that worthwhile anymore. Jack went back to school. Eventually, Jack started writing, perhaps because of the wisdom, or perhaps because of his new perspective. He wrote well. People liked that he wrote, and he became well known for it. After a time, Jack brought an RV and started traveling around the country for book signings and readings, but he still remembered the drop-by visit Nate occasionally. On one of the visits, Nate seemed quieter than usual. Not that Nate had been a fountain of joy lately. Jack's best guess was that Nate was still missing Samuel, and though Jack had tried, he hadn't been able to replace Samuel in Nate's eyes. Nate had been getting quieter each visit, but on this visit, Nate didn't even speak to Jack when he walked up to the lever. He nodded at Jack and then went back to staring into the desert. Jack, respecting Nate's silence, sat down and waited. After a few minutes, Nate spoke. "Jack, I have something to introduce to you." Jack looked surprised. "Something to introduce to me? This something to do with the big guy?" No. This is more personal. I want you to meet my son." Nate looked over at the nearest sand dune. "Sammy." Jack watched over as a 4-foot-long desert rattlesnake crawled from behind the dune up to the stone base of the lever. "Yo, Jack," said the new, much smaller snake. "Yo, Sammy." "Named after Samuel, I assume." Nate nodded. "Jack, I have a favor to ask you. Could you show Sammy around for me?" Nate unwrapped himself from the lever and slithered over to the edge and stone to look across the sands. "When Samuel first told me about the world and brought me the books and pictures, I wish I could go to see it. I wanted to see the great forests, the canyons, the cities, and even other deserts, to see if they felt and smelled the same. I want my own son to have that chance to see the world before he becomes bound here like I have been. He's seen it in pictures over the computer you brought to me, but it's not the same. And that being there is different. I want him to have that. Do you think you can do that for me, Jack?" Jack nodded. This was obviously very important to Nate, so Jack didn't even joke about a talking rattlesnake out to sea the world. "Yeah, I could do that for you, Nate. Is that all you need?" Jack could sense there was something else. Nate looked at Sammy. Sammy looked back at Nate for a second and then said, "Oh yeah, I gotta go pack. Pack in a little bit, Jack. Nice to meet you." Sammy slithered back over the dune and out of the slide. Nate watched Sammy disappear and then looked back at Jack. "Jack, this is my first son, my first offspring, through all the years. You don't even want to know what it took for me to find a mate." Nate grinned himself, but anyway, I have a son for a reason. I'm tired. I'm ready for it to be over. I needed a replacement. Jack considered this for a minute. "So you're ready to come see the world and you wanted him to touch the lever while you were gone?" Nate shook his head. "No, Jack. You're a better guesser than that. You've already figured it out. I'm bound here. There's only one way for me to leave here, and I'm ready. It's my time to die." Jack looked more closely. He could tell Nate had thought about this, probably for quite a while. Jack had a hard time imagining what it would be like to be as old as Nate, but Jack could already tell that in another 100 or 200 years, he might be getting tired of life himself. Jack could understand Samuel's decision, and now Nate's. So all Jack said was, "What do you want me to do?" Nate nodded. "Thanks, Jack. I only want two things. One, to show Sammy around the world, let him guess his fill of it, until he's ready to come back here and take over. Two, give me the fourth request. I can't just decide to die, not any more than you can. I won't even die of old age like you will eventually will, even though it'll be a long time from now. I need to be killed. Once Sammy is back here, ready to take over, I'll be able to die. And I need you to kill me. I've even thought about it, how poisons and other drugs won't work on me. I've seen pictures of snakes that were shot. Some of them lived for days. That's that too. I want you to bring back a sword." Nate turned away to look at the same thing that Sammy had gone behind. "I'd say an axe, but that's too somewhat undignified. Putting my head on the ground or chopping on a chopping block with that. No. I would like a sword. A time-honored way of going out, a dignified way to die, and most importantly, it would work, even on me. You're willing to do that for me, Jack?" Nate turned to look at Jack. "Yeah, Nate," replied Jack solemnly. "I think I can handle that." Nate nodded. "Good." He turned back toward the dune and shouted, "Sammy, Jack's about ready to leave." Then quietly, "Thanks, Jack." Jack didn't have anything to say. So he waited for Sammy to make it back to the lever, nodded to him, nodded a final time to Nate, and then decided into the desert with Sammy following. Over the next several years, Sammy and Jack kept in touch with Nate through email. They were about their adventures. They made a goal of visiting every country in the world and did a respectable job of it. Sammy had a natural gift for languages, as Jack expected he would, and even ended up acting as a translator for Jack in a few of the countries. Jack managed to keep the talking rattlesnake hidden, even so, and by the time they were nearing the end of their tour of countries, Sammy had only been spotted a few times. While there were several people that had seen enough to startle them greatly, nobody had enough evidence to prove anything, and while a few wild rumors and stories followed Jack and Sammy around, nothing would ever hit the newspapers or public in general. When they finished the tour of countries, Jackson suggested that they try some undersea diving. They did, and spelunking. They did that too. Sammy finally drew the last line at visiting Antarctica. He had come to realize that Jack was stalling. After talking to his dad about it over the email, he figured that Jack probably didn't want to have to kill Nate. Nate told Sammy that humans could be squeamish about killing friends and acquaintances. So Sammy eventually put his tail down, even though he didn't have a foot, and told Jack it was time. He was ready to go back and take up his duties from his dad. Jack delayed it a little more by insisting they go back to Japan and buy an appropriate sword. He even stretched it a little more by getting lessons on how to use the sword, but eventually he learned as much as he was likely to without dedicating his life to it, and was definitely competent enough to take the head off the snake. It was time to head back and see Nate. When they got back to the U.S., Jack got the old RV out of the storage where he and Sammy had left it after their tour of the 50 states. He loaded up Sammy and the sword, and they headed for the desert. When they got to the small town that Jack had been trying to find all those years, not only that, but he'd forgotten to figure out the time travel correctly, and it was late afternoon. They either have to spend the night in the town and walk out tomorrow, or walk in the dark. As Jack was afraid that he waited one more night, he might lose his resolve. He decided that he'd go ahead and drive the RV out there. It was only going to be this once, and Jack would walk back, cover the tracks afterward. They ought to be able to make it out there by nightfall if they drove, and they could get it overnight. Jack told Sammy over email, Nate, they were coming as he drove out of sight of the town on the road. Then they pulled off the road and headed out into the desert. Everything went well until they got to the sand dunes. Jack had been nursing the RV along the whole time, over the rocks, over the creek beds, revving the engine a few times. They almost got stuck. When they came to the dunes, Jack didn't really think about it. He just downshifted and headed up the first one. By the third dune, Jack started to regret that he decided to drive on the sand. The RV was fishtailing and losing traction. Jack was working up each dune slowly, and was trying to keep from losing control each time they came over top and slid down on the other side. Sammy had come up to sit on the passenger seat, coiled up and laughing at Jack's driving. As they came over the top of the fourth dune, the biggest one yet, Jack saw this was the final dune. The stone, the lever, and elsewhere, Nate waited below. Jack put on the brakes, but he got a little too far. The RV started slipping down the other slide. Jack tried turning the wheel, but he didn't have enough traction. He pumped the brakes, no response. They started sliding down the hill, faster and faster. Jack felt the shock go through him as he suddenly realized that they were heading for the lever. He looked down. The RV was directly on course for it. If Jack didn't do something, the RV would hit it. He was about to end humanity. Jack steered more frantically, trying to get traction, and it still wasn't working. The dune was too steep, and the sand too loose. In a split second, Jack realized this was the only chance he hit the stone around the lever. He should have traction on the stone for another way before he hit the lever. He wouldn't have time to stop, but he should be able to steer away. Jack took a better grip on the steering wheel and tried to turn the SRV a little bit. Every little bit would help. He'd given time to turn just right. The RV got to the bottom of the dune, sliding at the amazing spot on the speed of sand. Just before they reached the stone, Jack looked across to see that they were still heading for the lever. They were, but Jack noticed something else that he hadn't seen on top of the dune. Nate wasn't wrapped around the lever. He was off to the side of the lever, but he was still on the stone waiting for them. The problem was he was waiting on the same side of the lever that Jack had picked to steer towards to avoid the lever. The RV was already starting to drift away a little in his mad rush across the sand, and there was no way that Jack was going to be able to go around the other side. Jack had an instant of realization. He was either going to hit the lever or run over Nate. He glanced over at Sammy and saw that Sammy realized the same thing. Jack took a firmer grip on the steering wheel and the RV ran up the stone, shouting to Sammy as he pulled the steering wheel. Better late than never. He ran over the snake. The end.
It's better Nate than never, not late than